Chapter 12. A Swift Exit. Honno stormed down the passage, torch held aloft, and Fletch jogging to keep up. "You're making a big fuss, you numpty! He's harmless!" Honno ignored him, swinging the torch this way and that, following the trail of rope that had been left along the cave floor. Bligh and Ea were close behind, keeping their eyes peeled for any signs of their friends. "Would you... look, just... oi, listen to me!" Fletch dived in front of Honno, seizing the torch and pointing it at him. "Don't lose your nerve now! I've got everything under control, all right?"
"What about our friends?"
said Bligh, exasperated. The torch waved towards him threateningly. "If they've got any sense, they'll keep their heads too. This is not an emergency." "Shut up, Fletch." "Excuse me!" "No!" Honno clamped a hand over Fletch's face. "Didn't you hear that?" Everyone stayed very still, but Fletch wriggled. No one made a sound. Somewhere from deep in the stone, the smallest of echoes drifted on the air. It faded as quickly as it came, and was followed by a silence that was almost long enough to make them doubt they'd heard anything. Then it came again, a lot closer this time. Honno seized the torch and ran down the tunnel as the flames lit the stone in bursts of sandy yellow and rusty grey, flitting between flashes of darkness as their shadows ran past. The stream glittered from deep on their right. Their path seemed to be slanting upwards, and the ceiling was getting lower. It was more climbing than running now. Then something sprang at Honno, knocking him into Ea and Fletch, who both tumbled backwards. Someone else tripped and fell on top of them. The torch clattered down the rocky slope, rolling to almost a standstill, before slipping down a large crack at the base of the wall and vanishing from sight. Everyone tried to disentangle themselves in Bligh's dim light, but Abrian and Gina were in a very big hurry. "What are you doing here?"
"I can't see you. Who's that?"
"Where's Fletch?" "Here, you fat plonker!" "Would you get off? Hurry up, get up!" Abrian barely touched the floor as he yanked his friends upright. Gina was pulling Ea by the ponytail and Fletch by his cord.
What's going on?"
called Bligh, flying through the air beside them. "Evacuating!" shouted Abrian, scrambling up the passage as if the stone was on fire.
"I don't know where it's gone,"
called Gina, glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh no," Abrian groaned. The stream seemed to be running more actively beside them. Large waves were pushing their way down the passage from upstream, as if something very large was forcing the water out of its way. Abrian and Gina redoubled their pace, dragging the others helplessly in their wake. They were almost at the mouth of the tunnel opening into the cavern where the boat was moored, when they came to an abrupt halt. Something had got there first. For a brief moment, Bligh thought the rocks must be moving, but soon realised they bent and flexed too organically to be made of stone. Its legs were short and muscular, and there seemed to be 6 of them, with 5 thick-clawed toes at the end of each. A powerful, rigged tail the same length as the blue-grey body was draped across their landing ground, with its tip still in the water. None of them, even Abrian, had seen anything like it before. Gadav's head was buried in the rowing boat, and his sides were swelling like a blacksmith's bellows as he sniffed about. A few of the Goromasoltia still clung to his back, wiggling in a rather bemused manner, as if they hadn't quite registered that their bed had taken itself off for a walk. "You nosy stinker! That's not yours!" shouted Fletch, striding forwards, but Ea pulled him back, then immediately froze as Gadav lifted his snout from the boat and turned to look at them. He really did have a lot of teeth. His eyes were small, with a playful twinkle, but all the failed notion saw were the teeth. They stood, paralysed with terror, as Gadav's nostrils flared faster as he took in their fascinating scent. Very slowly, he took 1 step forwards, paused for a moment, then began advancing towards them very fast. That was more than enough. The failed notions with legs scattered, and Bligh darted upwards as Gadav dived for him. He was a massive beast, but he could move when he wanted to. No matter which way they ran, a part of Gadav was in the way. Hissing and rolling with his jaws wide open, he joyfully chased them. Fletch shouted something at him, but Gadav was enjoying himself too much to listen, crushing the rowing boat as he pursued Hono. With no other means of escape, Gia yelled for them to swim for it as he hovered over the dark stream. Abrian had already fallen into the shallows and was one step ahead of him, grabbing Ie and Gina before leaping into deeper water himself. Hono followed, pulling a furious Fletch behind him. Soon their toes couldn't reach the bottom, and the current swept them off their feet. Despite the water's gentle appearance, the current was unnervingly strong. They had no need to swim as it dragged them through the bowels of the underground. Kie desperately tried to keep track of everyone, while constantly looking back to see where their pursuer was, but he couldn't see anything. Gadav wasn't going to give up the game yet, but where he'd gone was anyone's guess. In the water, Kie's friends were struggling for breath and fighting not to be sucked under or slammed against rocks. They were beaten and bruised before the passage widened and the water grew shallow again. With a desperate scrambling effort, they waded or crawled free of the water and onto firm ground. Abrian had to wade back in to pull out Ie, who was liable to sink on account of his stitches. Through their dripping, sore confusion, Gina felt the softest waft of fresh air on her skin. It was coming from the shadows to their left. Behind them, the water began breaking into threatening waves again. "I'd like to get out, Abrian! I'd like to get out now, right now!" called Ie, struggling backwards as Abrian hauled him out. "Gie, light the way!" shouted Hono. They pelted up the left passage, following the wafts of air. It grew stronger with every step, though the rocks were rough on their hands and knees as they clambered over them. A low, guttural hiss in the darkness behind them indicated Gadav was on his way. The rocks were growing distinguishable now. Kie's blue glow wasn't as effective anymore. And suddenly there was light as they spilled out of the tunnel into an immense space. The cave roof arched away up over their heads as if it had been carved out with a gigantic spoon. An opening at the very top showed a ragged window of grey sky. Rain was dripping through and falling soundlessly down the long drop to the stone floor. This must have been the sinkhole Fletch had mentioned. The sinkhole by the cliffs, and its opening could be their escape. If only they could reach it.
"I'll distract it!"
shouted Kie as Gadav's snout appeared at the other end of the tunnel. The walls were uneven, with plants growing out of the rock that fell away as they took hold of them. Everyone's arms ached and their shoes were torn, but the set of teeth below them was excellent motivation to keep climbing. If they could just get through the opening, Gadav wouldn't be able to reach them. Hono managed to heave himself onto a small ledge halfway up, and leant over to help Abrian, who was struggling with the sodden basket still strapped to his back. "Take it!" panted Abrian, slipping it off and passing it one-handed to Hono. "I need to catch my breath!" Hono seized the basket, then moved to make room for the others. Down below, Kie was working hard to get Gadav's attention, but a ghost just wasn't half as interesting as live failed notions.
"Keep going, it's fine,"
he called, trying to sound encouraging as he flitted around Gadav's head to entice him away. But Gadav didn't want to lose his new playmates, and was pacing along the foot of the wall, his head swaying from side to side as they struggled tantalizingly above him. "Fletch, what are you doing?" gasped Hono as he spotted the boy scaling the wall on the opposite side. "Just climbing, stupid!" shouted Fletch, clearly very annoyed at all of them. "Go on, up you go!" Hono could barely take his eyes from the teeth below them, but he obeyed. The opening was very close now. Rain was falling into their eyes. It was a matter of a few meters, but then Gadav decided to jump. With his long, muscular tail and his 4 back legs, he propelled himself upwards in a powerful spring. His jaws closed on thin air, though it nearly snapped their wits in two. Kie felt thoroughly insulted at his inadequacy as a plaything for the beast. Gadav crawled back across the floor and gazed up at the failed notions, assessing.
"Hey, not them! Look! Look this way!"
shouted Kie, realising what was going to happen, but Gadav was already crouching again. Like an arrow from a bow, he sprung upwards just as Gina, who was last, looked up to the sky above. Gadav's jaws clamped shut on her long hair, and she was pulled backwards off the rock face. She landed hard on top of his snout and rolled off like a doll. "Oi! Come here! Come here!" Fletch was holding on to the wall, leaning outwards. Gadav knew his voice and decided to listen this time. He turned his head with Gina's golden hair in his teeth and took a few plodding steps towards Fletch, dragging the still attached Gina along the floor. "Good! Now drop it!" Gadav gave the hair a shake and took 2 steps back. "Gadav!" The jaws stayed shut and the nostrils snorted. "I said drop!" Then Fletch set his feet against the wall and pushed himself into the air. It was over in 10 seconds. But more things happened in those 10 seconds than Bligh could possibly take in. As he looked up, he saw the cord around Fletch strain and break, saw his shirt tear as 2 wings unfurled from his back, and gaped as the boy glided at top speed through the air before smacking into Gadav. Then Bligh blinked, and there was Fletch on top of Gadav's neck, his skinny arms prizing the massive jaws open. Gina staggered upright, pulling her hair from the teeth, and shot back to the wall. Fletch's wings strained as he held on to Gadav's jaws as long as he could. Bligh could only stare in mingled shock and amazement. Finally, Fletch couldn't hold on any longer and let go, jumping backwards, using his wings like a kite to steady his landing. Bligh saw his friends were almost at the top of the cave, but the roof nearest the opening was formed into a cruel overhang. Gadav saw them too, and began to crawl his way to the foot of the wall, his claws scraping against the rocks. "You are being a naughty little—" Fletch shouted, taking a run-up and leaping at Gadav, wrapping his arms as far as he could around his bulk, dragging the creature a few inches down the wall, but Gadav hardly noticed him. He was fixed on one thing alone. Well, 4 things to be precise, struggling just above him. Abrian was in the lead. He looked down over his shoulder and instantly wished he hadn't, as those teeth shone back at him. The rim of the sinkhole was close, but he would have to let go with his legs and use his arms, as the overhang forced him horizontal. "Hurry if you can, Abrian! It's a bit uncomfortable here," called Honno, while Gadav made a snap at his tail.
"Ooh, wow!"
gasped Bligh, as Abrian let his legs drop away from the wall and hung on with just his arms, the others close behind. Abrian could feel the rock digging into his fingers, and his arms were screaming at him. All he could see was the rock face. All he could feel was his own weight wrenching at his shoulder muscles. Gritting his teeth, he tore a shaking arm off the stone, his other hand about to give out, and made a grab for the rim of the hole, and missed. He felt the fingers of his other hand slip from the rock, felt everything rush upwards as he began to plummet. But he didn't fall as far as he feared he would. He felt a terrible jolt in his arm and something tight on his wrist. Blinking upwards, he saw a pair of hands clutched around his own, and a pair of beetroot pink eyes grinned down at him over the mouth of the hole. They blinked, then nearly went cross-eyed with effort as they pulled him upwards. In a few seconds, Abrian was able to get his other arm outside the hole and wriggled until his top half fell onto damp grass. Rolling over, dizzy with fear and surprise, he came face to face with a very familiar small person.
"I know. I am clever, aren't I?"
said Annie, beaming.
"You know, I think I just saved your life."
"You can save ours too, please!" someone shouted from within the hole. Annie jumped and hurried back.
"Ooh, there's more of you!"
"Annie? It's Annie?" Gadav sprang and nearly got hold of EA's feet. Annie collapsed into giggles. "Stop laughing, it's not funny!"
"Aw, just one more second,"
snorted Annie.
"The monster thing's going to do a big jump again."
"Now, Annie!" It took a fair while, plus a lot of near slips, before Honno, Gina and EA were lying next to Abrian, safe, out of breath and aching, but in the open. A cool breeze ruffled the air, and they could hear waves sloshing somewhere at the foot of the cliff. They had emerged onto a high, grassy space, where the surrounding forest thinned out to allow what small headland Illa had to jut out into the sea. The ground was uneven, ploughed with troughs and dips. The sinkhole was the largest of these, descending into the ground until it split into the opening through which they'd climbed. The sounds of Fletch reprimanding Gadav drifted up through the hole. Meanwhile, Annie had started telling her friends all about how she'd managed to find them, but she didn't get very far. As soon as they had strength to sit up, Abrian and Honno were hugging her so tight she had to stop chattering just to breathe. They had all completely forgotten about her. They hadn't even wondered what might have happened to her after the fish had struck. Now the days that lay behind them filled up with her absence until it was almost too much to bear. Their capable, bright, and wonderfully ridiculous Annie had, of course, done perfectly well on her own, and had managed to find them in the nick of time, while they had, once again, got into a perfect mess of trouble. They had never felt so stupid or so ashamed all their lives.
My head's going to fall off!
Annie croaked, and they eventually let go. Agah and Gina all looked very embarrassed as well, and earnestly told her how much they owed her thanks.
Well, I am amazing, I suppose,
said Annie, glowing with pride.
So, who's that down there?
My name is Fletch, came Fletch's voice from below. And I can hear you! Annie leant her chin over the hole, and her eyes sparkled as Gadav looked up at her and sniffed.
I do like your monster thingy,
she said, cupping her hands around her mouth. He's my Gadav, and you can tell your friends, if they hadn't run around, he wouldn't be all over excited now. He's only a baby. He thought you wanted to play.
You hear that? You're all idiots,
Annie called over her shoulder. The others nodded miserably. We know. Gadav hissed and snapped at Fletch, who gave him a hard shove. Behave! No, they've gone now. They're not coming back down. Another hiss. Yeah, get over it. Go on, push off. Fletch gave Gadav an affectionate slap and a rub as he slunk towards the dribbling stream. He gave one last look up at the gap in the roof, then disappeared into the dark of the tunnels once more. In a few minutes Fletch had joined them on the surface, having half flapped, half climbed up like a butterfly negotiating flowers. His wings were rather scruffy close up, and looked dirty and bent. He looked rather bemused as they stared at him. What? He asked. You've all got tails, after all. I don't know why you're so surprised. We've never met anybody with... Well, lucky you, said Fletch. I'm the only one like me. There used to be more once, I reckon. Tenir and the islanders don't like it. Reminds them our kind won't go away. He sniggered. It gets on their nerves every day.
Why does it get on their nerves?
Asked Annie, always ready to take notes. Because some people don't know what to do when you come with extra bits, laughed Fletch, stretching. The wind blew again, blowing the rain into their faces. Abrian felt his hands stinging and sighed. Time was getting on.
What's in here?
Asked Annie, peeling open the lid of their one remaining, rather battered basket. What we had been collecting, said Abrian.
Hate to tell you, but it looks like a horrid slimy mess,
said Annie.
Wait, there's still stuff in there?
Exclaimed Gina, seizing the basket and wrenching it open further. Despite being squashed, flooded, and crushed through the caves, it still contained a miraculous amount of sticky threads from the Goromasoltia. Abrian gaped. They had both thought their cargo had been lost. Honno stared, then laughed. You got some? Yes, we got some, said Abrian, suddenly forgetting the aches and stings and feeling 100 times better. Annie had no idea why they were making such a fuss over a basket of slime, but she was given several explanations as they were led by Fletch away from the cliffs and back to the village. They were cold, shaken and bruised all over, but finally they had won a step forward in their plan. Honno and Abrian didn't stop apologising to Annie, who had already forgiven them a long time before she told them so. She enjoyed their new shamefaced attitude. Gina, and Ie all stayed quiet, but felt equally guilty. Annie much preferred them to focus on how she had saved everyone just in time through a miraculous stroke of luck. After the fish had released her, Annie had travelled very fast for a very long while. She thought pink magic had something to do with it. She must have passed out, because when she opened her eyes again, there was a lot of salt water up her nose and sand in her mouth, as she lay on a beach with the sea tickling her ankles. She had never been on a sandy beach before, so had crunched up quite a lot in her mouth before realising it wasn't very nice. Where the tide had swept her to was anyone's guess, but Alariana later explained it must have been Ilhutu, the smallest island of the archipelago, that lay almost completely hidden behind Allaire. Nobody lived there because it held a wide, shallow lake of viciously hot, steaming water. When Annie woke up on Ilhutu's beach, it was very dark. All around her were tall rocks and a haze of fog. Vents of steam came from cracks in the ground, like someone had buried boiling kettles underneath it. A deep orange glow broke through the clouds for a fleeting moment, and made the whole island seem as if it was on fire. Though she'd never admit it, it made her quite uneasy. Once daylight had spread itself over the island, and the rain fell as constantly as ever, Annie explored until she came to the edge of Ilhutu's lake. She was feeling very thirsty from all the sand and seawater she'd swallowed, but found the rim was encircled by pools of glutinous mud which let loose lazy bubbles and odd smells. She had gone to poke one to see if it would be worth a taste, but then caught sight of the shape of Allaire in the distance, and the tiny smudge of a ship disappearing around its eastern side. Making up her mind that her friends must be worrying about her and wondering what she had done to the big fish, she decided it was only fair to find them and set their minds at rest that she only made it sick. Skirting the long banks of the lake, she wandered through the forest of vapours and hopped over clear pools with orange, yellow and blue beds. As she reached the far end of the island, however, she saw to her great annoyance that there was a broad channel of sea between the shores of Ilhutu and Allaire. Annie knew she was too hungry to try and swim across, and whatever she had said back at home, and no matter how many times she'd fallen in the castle's moat, she had never really got the knack. So Annie sat on the edge of this steaming, smelly spot of land, staring at the green slopes of the island beyond, and soon began to feel a little lonely. Hours drifted by while she churned over how to seek further vengeance on the fish that swallowed her, on the sea for being so unnecessarily salty, and on her hat, which hadn't managed to escape the inside of the fish with her. The latter was perhaps the worst betrayal of all. She was an extremely magically spirited small person who was unnaturally powerful. The hat was a piece of fabric that really didn't have to make that much effort, but it hadn't even managed to choke the fish or float loyally beside her when she washed up on the shore. It was dead to her now. She must have been thinking about this for a long time, because she suddenly found herself opening her eyes and sitting up. Sleep must have crept up on her while she sat thinking, because the daylight seemed far less like morning and much more like late afternoon, and it was raining hard. Rubbing her eyes, she slowly remembered her tricky predicament, but before her heart could quite finish sinking, it suddenly rose again like a cork. While she dozed, the tide had been at work, pulling away from the shore and opening up a thin bank of sand that ran between the two islands. It was as if the sea had made a path just for her, though it wasn't going to wait around all day for her to cross it. The tide had already begun its work closing the gap, and waves on the Allaire side were already reconnecting. Annie ran as fast as she could for the first 20 seconds, then found her legs were extremely tired and she had a stitch. Tiredness was a feeling almost unknown to her, and she cursed sleep for creeping up on her. This new sensation came as a shock. She soon recovered and made it very clear to tiredness that it was, and always would remain, her enemy, right up there with her disloyal, treacherous hat. The gap between the islands was a lot longer than it initially appeared, and Annie had to wade the last of it before she finally staggered onto the shores of Allaire. Once she was safe on the new island, tiredness scored another point, and Annie found her legs getting wobbly. A short nap, huddled in the shelter of a hollow tree, unexpectedly grew into a good night's sleep. When she awoke, Annie felt very pleased at her ability to fight tiredness with her eyes closed. She'd obviously done a ferocious job because it had completely fled from her by the morning and didn't bother her all day while she explored the rim of the island. Her plan was if she could circle the entire coast of the island, the ship would eventually appear. Getting up onto the cliffs seemed like a good route to take, as she might get a decent view of the place from there. But she soon became intrigued by the dips, drops and hollows that peppered the cliff tops, and so stayed a while, enjoying finding out which ones led to bottomless pits. It was only when she was thinking of moving on that the sound of echoing voices, one speaking in capital letters, had floated across on the wind, coming from the lowest and deepest of the holes. "I'm so sorry, Annie," said Abrion for the 200th time. Annie giggled, soaking up the pathos like a sponge.
"You'll have to love me forever now. Anyway, isn't there anyone else stuck in that cave? Did everyone else stay on the ship?"
She was keen to show off some more heroicism before the end of the day. While Hono explained all that had happened after Annie had been swallowed by the fish, Gie felt another pang of anxiety as he felt once more the significant lack of Delilah. He tried to distract himself, listening to Fletch explain to Annie how he had found Gadav in the mysterious vanishing crack in the cave, heard Abrion wondering if Pippa would take to turnips, and Hono complaining about his sore head. It took them considerably longer to get back to the village compared to their journey that morning, as the sinkhole was in quite a different part of the island. But they were back at Alariana's house now, packing away their dry clothes and belongings. Gina recounted their terrifying escape in the dark when Gadav first found them, while Alariana looked for jars as Abrion and Annie scooped out the slime from the basket. Alariana stayed quiet as they worked, but inside she overflowed with happiness. Out of everything she had left behind after leaving Feldnor, she had missed Annie the most. To have her suddenly appearing after the arrival of the rest of her friends was almost too much for her to process. Meanwhile, Annie, who took almost every strange surprise completely in her stride, kept up an unbroken stream of chatter as if Alariana hadn't left at all. Alariana nodded and said the occasional,
"Oh, really?"
or,
"And then what did you do?"
But she wasn't taking much in. She was just happy to float in the hubbub of voices filling her house.
"And I thought we were going to die! It was amazing,"
said Gina, her eyes sparkling.
"It was just like the adventures we said we'd have when we were smaller."
She glanced towards EA, but he somehow became very busy stowing his book away. Gie wondered if she meant when she, EA and Gie used to run wild in Feldnor as children. Well, Gie had been brought along for the ride, but they had all been very happy. EA and Gina used to get along so well. The more Gie thought about this, the more that hopeful feeling resurfaced again inside him. EA was reading all the time. Gina had problems with her magic. Gie inwardly squeaked as an idea popped into his head. EA must be reading to find a way to help Gina with her problems, just as Gie had done for Delilah once. He smiled to himself. Maybe EA wasn't so different from him after all. "Why are you pulling that face, Gie?" Gie remembered where he was and saw his brother looking at him nervously.
"I was smiling, EA."
It looked sinister.
"A smile isn't sinister."
Whatever you're thinking must be.
"It's nothing."
But Gie couldn't help but snigger to himself, looking sideways at his dear brother. Oh, so secretive, yet oh, so easy to read. EA began edging away, but Gie took no notice. Suddenly there was a gust of air which blew all these thoughts from Gie's mind as the front door opened. Fletch froze, reaching for something while standing on the table, using his wings for balance. Tenir stood in the doorway, the regular pouch of money in his hand. His eyes fell on a shirtless Hono changing into his dry clothes. Abrion and Gina decanting glittering slime into jars while fending off Annie, who was still covered in fish vomit. Then he noticed EA rebandaging his tail, and Gie hovering by the ceiling with a strange smile on his face. Last but not least, his eyes settled on Alariana and her twitching ears. "I'm really, really sorry," said Abrion for the 400th time that day.
"Honestly, I said it's fine."
said Alariana, placing her travelling bag beside their gear on the edge of the harbour wall.
Look, I'm going to be honest. In all fairness, it was only a matter of time before they told me to leave. Or I decided to go myself. I think it will do Fletch good too. Getting away from Ilar, that is.
All the same, Abrion felt thoroughly guilty as he watched Honno loading Alariana's small collection of belongings into the dinghy, being careful not to hit his head on its sail. Tenir had at least provided them with a small boat. It was his kindest way of insisting they all leave the island at once, and it could take Fletch and Alariana on to wherever they needed to go. They would all take this boat back to the ship, on which their two friends could travel with them as far as the mainland of Tengasharu at the foot of the archipelago. Then each party would go their separate ways. Despite the sorry situation, Chie felt glad his old friend would be travelling with them, even if it was for a short while. He also wondered where she and Fletch would journey on to, what they would see, and if they would be able to find a quiet place to live in peace.
Where is Fletch, by the way?
He asked, chuckling to himself at the idea of Fletch and peace coinciding in the same sentence.
He went to go get himself some supplies for the trip,
said Alariana.
Though he shouldn't need that much anyway. You said your ship was resupplying here after all. Oh, I think that's him coming now.
Fletch's voice was drifting on the wind. You always heard Fletch before you saw him. Sure enough, the boy soon appeared, his arms filled with a heavy sack. 3 girls followed him, heaving another, even larger sack between them.
Slow down, Fletch, or we'll drop them,
called one. Keep up, said Fletch over his shoulder, throwing his sack into the boat, where it successfully landed on Honno.
Fletch, what's this?
asked Alariana, bemused. You mean them? Fletch glanced at the girls. They're my friends. The blonde 2 sell me the turnips, and the brown-haired one is staying with them. He bowed theatrically to the girls. Lay, and Anu, this is Alariana, who I told you about. Alariana went a little pink in the cheeks and smiled shyly.
It's very nice to meet you 3.
Fletch is our best customer,
said the girl called Em, twiddling with a lock of her blonde hair.
I like your ears,
she added, gazing at Alariana's fluffy ears as they twitched with every word. Alariana was flattered and rather taken aback by the compliment.
Say, you have a tail?
said Chie, no longer bothering to stay opaque and peering curiously at the girls. Lay nodded happily. Yep, my family come from Fealdnor. We're allowed to stay here because we're only passing through. We're travelling the world and stopped off for a bit. Em and Anu and Fletch have been great friends.
You're very lucky,
said Alariana.
You know, I felt sure that not everyone on this island was the same as Tenir.
Of course not,
said Anu kindly.
It'd be really boring if we couldn't meet interesting new people.
Alariana and Chie exchanged looks. They were very rarely considered interesting in such a positive way. Hey, do you want to see a trick? asked Lay, breaking the awkward silence. She flexed her fingers, cracked her knuckles, and let a burst of red magic fly from her fingertips. It fell like rosy snowflakes around their heads, settling on their hair and noses. Chie stared. You use red magic? Lay nodded. Yeah, and Anu can do purple. With a nudge from her sister, Anu took a deep breath, lifted her finger, and in a few sweeping movements she'd drawn a dazzling swirl of violet in the air, which shimmered and crackled.
That's amazing,
said Chie, while Alariana nodded enthusiastically. The girls beamed. Fletch cleared his throat, keen to draw some attention back to himself. Yes, ghosts are easily entertained. Now, you will remember what we agreed?
Of course, don't worry,
said Em.
Every other week, turnips, down the sinkhole and a belly rub.
Good, said Fletch approvingly. Em's good with looking after beasties. She's going to take care of Gadav for me. Chie and Alariana exchanged worried looks, but once Fletch had hopped into the boat, Em leaned in and whispered.
Don't worry. Between you and me, Gadav doesn't need to eat turnips. We've been visiting him for ages. He just likes the attention and having his teeth brushed.
Would you two hurry up? Called EA from the boat, pulling Annie away from the side as she made a dive at a passing fish.
Well, I'm really glad I was able to meet you,
said Alariana, shaking each girl by the hand, probably more firmly than she meant to.
It's good to know there are some people as nice as you here. You can show the rest of Illa how to do things right.
Keep up the magic practice,
called Chie, giving them a wave goodbye, before quickly flipping over the wall and gliding after his friends. The three girls waved goodbye, then headed back into the village. They had an oversized baby monster thingy waiting, doubtlessly looking forward to a scratch under the chin. As the boat gently bobbed through the water, Alariana sighed, looking a lot happier.
I wish I met those three sooner. All the youngest. She made my heart melt. I wish I'd told her.
I'm sure they know somehow,
said Chie, floating beside the boat as they rowed, sailing it was far too fiddly, back towards the waiting ship. The sailors had finished making repairs and the ship was ready by early that afternoon. They found themselves with nothing to do while they waited to see if the failed notions came back empty-handed, alive, or neither of the above. Morland was tending to his fruit tree. There was one small, oval-shaped fruit peeping from under its leaves. It was greenish-yellow and looked rather unappetising. Haidur stretched himself across a comfortable piece of woodwork at the prow, while Bligh sat close behind, conducting a mock therapy discussion. This helped to release some of their oh-so-many woes, most of which they happily decided had failed notions as their root cause.
And when did you realise your mother despised you?
Oh, very early on,
said Haidur in a matter-of-fact tone.
She always said she felt an immense sense of disappointment ever since I arrived.
Ah,
said Bligh knowledgeably.
I felt quite the same. It's like this empty, black chasm inside that I just couldn't understand until I heard the name Haidur, and then it all made sense.
Yes, quite,
nodded Haidur.
And do you think Seaward has anything to do with how you are?
Oh, without a doubt. He's a constant plague on my existence.
It's where all our dear failed notions learned it from,
agreed Bligh, smirking as Seaward strolled by, listening to their talk and nibbling from the box of hardtack Pippa wouldn't eat.
Well, you know what the problem there is, of course.
Haidur went on.
What?
Bligh asked his patient.
Seaward's an imbecile.
Both of them collapsed, sniggering as the box of hardtack missed Haidur's ear by inches. Haidur leapt up and chased a cackling Seaward who hid behind the mast.
You know what this means?
Said Haidur, hardtack box in hand.
Eat it!
Shouted Seaward, and ducked for cover as Haidur tried to force the box into his mouth. Bligh, meanwhile, seized his opportunity and settled into the now vacant relaxation spot, looking very pleased. As the noise on deck continued, and he was just drifting into a doze, he got the prickling feeling that someone was watching him. He opened an eye and saw something blue hovering above him. He sighed.
Mr. Ghost, you are so very difficult to wake up yourself. Why are you going to all the trouble of waking me?
Oh, good. I thought you might be dead,
said Chie, looking relieved.
Can you lower the ladder and let the others up?
Bligh opened his other eye and peered over the side to look down at the failed notions, bobbing in the dinghy below.
That's not the boat you left with,
he said after a moment.
We know,
said Chie carefully.
Where's the first boat?
It's really nice to see you again,
called Annie, smiling as sweetly as she could.
Did you catch any fish?
You are all very within range,
muttered Bligh, getting up from his spot. Relaxation time was over. In 15 minutes, the little dinghy had been secured with a line so it floated behind the stern, and the failed notions were back on board, recounting almost everything that had happened. They were reluctant to go into too much detail about their many and various mistakes, and focused on showing the sailors the jars of slime from the Goramasoltia and introducing Alariana and Fletch. The latter had been warned that unless he kept to a vow of sacred, unbroken silence, he would be flying the journey by himself, underwater. "You're rich!" he shouted to the sailors as soon as he stepped on board.
Fletch!
hissed Alariana. "What? Their boat is huge!" "We're only borrowing it," said Honno flatly.
It's too nice.
Said Morland, watching Alariana and Fletch from the corner of his eye.
2 nights, and then our charity ends. By then, His Highness will have surely rejoined us, and there will be unequivocally no room.
They haven't come back yet?
Asked Chie, looking up.
Do you see them?
said Morland bluntly, picking up his fruit tree and pushing through Chie.
Sorry I asked,
said Chie, annoyed.
Well, if you want to see your dear lady friend again, I'd get to work. All of you.
Snapped Morland.
And you, keep yourself out of the way.
He added to Chie, who frowned but decided to say nothing for the time being.
This will all end in tears now the ghost's back. I just know it.
Morland muttered to himself, stomping away to notify the captain. Alariana and Fletch soon found themselves put to good use, while Honno, Abrian, Ie and Gina didn't even have time to sit down before they were hauling out sheets and guiding the ship out of Ilar's waters. Only Annie was allowed a rest. Being swallowed and consequently regurgitated by a gigantic fish, then stranded on a barren island before rescuing her comrades, had earned Annie a notch of golden respect from the Nausians. In the light of their newfound admiration, they had almost forgotten that it was her magical antics that had lured the giant fish to them in the first place. Indeed, they were far more inclined to believe it had all been the fault of the only other luminous glowing person on board, who must have caught the fish's eye. There was one other reason Annie was encouraged away from work. No Nausian with half a right mind would get involved in the private world of women's grooming. It simply wasn't proper. However, when a lady, even one as small as Annie, wished that strongly of sulphur from the lake of Ilhutu, the mouldy inside of a tree stump, and fish vomit, they were forced to drop a few hints that she should spend her free time taking a bath. Annie being Annie, however, no such thought crossed her mind as she breezed past the stepping stone trail of soap blocks, scrubbing brushes, mops, and all the buckets carefully placed in her path. She pranced into the nearest hammock, not hers of course, she didn't want to get it dirty, and fell fast asleep as the ship pointed its nose away from Ilar and its siblings, and began making its way to Tengasharu, and the hope of finally reuniting with their friends.